Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we have returning guest, the well-known journalist who was based in Syria, Vanessa Beeley, now based in Beirut. We're going to talk to her about what happened in Syria and caught a lot of us by surprise. Welcome back, Vanessa.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's lovely to see you two guys again.
I think we should start by you telling us the story of how you managed to escape what was happening in Syria, because we were all very worried about you, and I'm sure a lot of other people.
I think everyone's kind of probably bored of hearing me talking about it now, but I'll just quickly go over it. I mean, I think the important thing for people to understand, because a lot of questions are being raised. Why didn't anybody know what was happening? Why was it such a big surprise, and so on? And we'll kind of cover some of that, I hope. But ultimately, so during the day on the Saturday, we'd been told that there was going to be a gradual transitional process, and that the president would stay for 6 months and oversee the process. So that at that point was what had been negotiated. And then someone else called me and said, you have to leave immediately. And then another person called me and said, no, it's fine. There's going to be a ceasefire in 8 hours. And so then we'll have time to, figure out what we do. So I was like, with 6 dogs around me and the cats and everything else, I had packed, as little as I could, because I guessed I would be traveling pretty fast. So I decided to wait out that night, which was a bit of a mistake, because actually not necessarily the HTS militants entered the suburbs of Damascus, but all of the criminal elements from the outskirts of Damascus, like places like Wadi Barada and Dimas, and many of the areas that had previously taken amnesty and reconciliation, which was brokered by the government and by Russia, saw their opportunity to come in and start stealing and looting and generally just making a noise and firing their guns in the air and driving around yelling at everyone and stealing cars that had been left on the streets and so on. So that's, I think, pretty much what happened. The actual HTS terrorist factions didn't enter my area, but more this sort of criminal element. They were firing their guns in the air and shooting into the garden and kind of shooting at some of the buildings. And they were breaking into a number of the buildings and looting. They were stealing cars from the streets. And this went on all night. And of course, in Syria, there's no electricity. So everything was plunged into darkness. All you had was these noises. And they changed the azan from the beautiful sound that it always was to the kind of Salafist Wahhabi monotone dirge. So that was another sign that they had taken over the mosque and so on. So they were close. And they were also kind of, at the time Israel began the bombing of the air defense, particularly in Damascus. And of course, a lot of that is very close to me. So the bunker buster bombs were being used for the first time in Syria, because normally the air defense would repel any incoming missiles. But of course, now Israel had free rein to enter Syrian airspace, and they were using bunker buster bombs on the air defense bases. So the whole house was shaking from kind of midnight onwards. And then in the morning, between 9 and 10, they were still there. They were still obviously breaking into houses and looting. They tried to break into mine. They kind of battered on the door a number of times, but 6 dogs, I think they decided against it because they were all going crazy, and I managed to yell at them in Arabic. So after about 3 attempts, they went off. But at that point, I decided, okay, I think this is the time that I need to leave, because I don't know what's going to happen now. And if they enter the house, the dogs are going to get hurt, and so on. Like, all these things going through my mind. So I had my bag packed. The driver came. I took the one dog that really wouldn't cope with being left alone. And I had to leave the 5 dogs and the 3 cats behind. I'd already made some provision for people to come in and feed them and take care of them, and for them to be taken to friends of mine in Damascus, but I didn't factor in the fact that the whole area would be occupied and that people wouldn't be allowed to leave and they wouldn't be allowed to take things out of the houses and so on. So they've been there really since I left. A friend's been going in and feeding them and taking care of them. And today they finally got out and went to another friend of mine where it's a bit safer, because the whole area is still getting heavily bombed because of the military installations there in the mountains. And now, in fact, the Zionist forces are only about 10 minutes away from my house. They've come in so far towards the outskirts of Damascus. They're about 20 kilometers away from the city center, from Mesle, for example, but about literally 5 minutes drive from where I used to live.
So have you heard any, I mean, I guess you have, like, what have your friends and neighbors said about the current situation? Or, like, are they still being, like, are their houses still being attacked and invaded by these zombies, or?
Yeah, my neighbor called me, one of my neighbors called me about 2 days later just to make sure I was okay. But also he said they're forming a committee to patrol the streets with guns to kind of prevent the wholesale looting that was going on. But then again, speaking to other friends there who have been left to take care of a villa where the owners have evacuated, because where I was, it used to always be a military area. So it's a prime target, because these were houses kind of given to the military when they were decommissioned or whatever, but usually kind of, no, not only high level military, just military. So that's why it's a big target. And in fact, now HTS is talking about they're going to confiscate these houses. And that means, of course, they'll loot all of them. So there is still a high risk of the house getting broken into. So, I've just in the last few days been going crazy trying to get the dogs safe. And then also, I can't bring any more stuff with me. I can't get someone to bring any more stuff, because where am I going to put it? I'm living in a hotel room. So it's impossible. So I've just kind of distributed everything to friends and people that need things, because there was a ton of things left, all my belongings for the last 5 years. But it's nothing. Everyone that has left with nothing. Let's put it that way. Everyone is, whether they're in Lebanon or Iraq or Russia, they've got nothing. They've literally just got the clothes on their back. That's it.
But most journalists don't have this kind of experience to, like, sympathize with with the region that they're in. I mean, this is kind of an interesting case where you can absolutely empathize with what the people are going through, because you've gone through it yourself. So yeah, it's I think I'm impressed with the strength that you've been able to do this with. I mean, having to leave 5 dogs behind that are your, I don't know, pets.
It broke my heart. It's still really hard to kind of see the pictures of them. At least they're safe. Yeah. And if I get settled somewhere, then I'll try to bring at least one other. One of them's actually gone to my friend as a guard dog, because she's a big barker. So he said, please, can we keep her? Because they're afraid of getting broken into. But if they hear a dog, then they tend to think twice about it. So she's gone there to take care of the family there, which I'm really kind of pleased about, because the boys love her. So, I feel like at least she's being a good protector, and it's nice for them to feel protected also. So,
wow.
So, yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead. I have a question.
So I want to ask you, like, were you surprised, or when were you surprised, or if you weren't at all, like, at what time you started expecting things coming and getting to this extent of aggression that we're seeing?
Yeah, it is a good question, and it's certainly one that everyone is asking, like, how did they not know? The fact is they did know. There had been preparations for an invasion from Idlib for more than 3 months, and I had talked about it previously. A number of people had talked about it previously. And when the ceasefire was brokered between Lebanon and Israel, it became very apparent that Netanyahu saw it as an opportunity to pivot towards Syria and cut all of the supply lines from Syria to Hezbollah, so Hezbollah wouldn't have an opportunity to resupply during the ceasefire, but of course Israel would, with a new weapons shipment from the United States, who obediently carried out that role. So people were prepared, and I think to a large extent we were prepared for Israel to carry out a bombing campaign. I think most of us thought that that would be kind of the strategy. And the army was prepared for an invasion from Jolani's forces in Idlib. There were 30,000 troops stationed at Aleppo. The northern Hamas front had been established. The Syrian Christian National Defense Forces had been preparing for some time. But when the attack came, I think in hindsight, nobody expected Turkey to be involved. Like everyone was expecting the Northwest and HTS and the foreign mercenaries under his control and the various terrorist groups under his control to lead the attack. We knew that Ukrainian special forces had been in Idlib for about a year, training Jolani's forces, giving them equipment, giving them drone technology on top of what had been given to them previously, of course, by Turkey and by the NATO member state alliance. And they'd had 5 years to prepare because of the ceasefire that had been brokered between Russia and Turkey back in 2020. That was fine, but when Turkey's proxy forces, like all of the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which was formerly the Free Syrian Army, the Muslim Brotherhood factions, also took part in the attack, that was, I think, to a degree unexpected. So the sheer volume of forces that came from the northwest and the north was unexpected, I think. And then we had this sort of strange scenario where the Syrian army, particularly in the west, seemed to withdraw. At the time, we were analyzing that as being a tactical withdrawal because they didn't withdraw to Hama, they withdrew to a perimeter around Aleppo, creating a kind of buffer zone in which the terrorists were being kettled and were, at that time, being bombed. In East Aleppo, there was one brigade of the Syrian Arab Army, at least, that refused to stand down at any point. So even when the Syrian army withdrew, this brigade kept fighting. The Russian command, who was on the eastern side, withdrew completely. So Commander Kessel took all his forces back to Haimamim at that point and left the Syrian army forces fighting alone. Those forces then, when it became apparent that they were overwhelmed, they came to the south to Khanasa Road to the southern point of Aleppo to Al Safira, where the evacuees from Nubal and Zara, the Shia towns to the northwest of Aleppo, had been trapped alongside some of the military cadets and other security officials that were trying to escape. And they liberated those people. At that point, it still appeared as if this was some kind of trap that had been set for the terrorists to get them to come out of Idlib and to maybe contain them in northern Hamar and then defeat them by bombing them heavily in the open territory that is in northern Hamar. At that point, the command of the whole operations was changed to a commander who, to a large degree, has strong affiliations with Turkey. With Russia. And at that point, northern Hama was under attack. And still then we thought at that point that the Syrian army was continuing to fight. And I am not one of those people that is going to condemn the Syrian Arab army because I think, in my opinion, a deal was made before this entire operation and that they, to a large degree, were also betrayed. this is my opinion based on a lot of information that I've gathered since I left Syria and information that I was being given on the ground while the battles were ongoing. And it was from really Hama onwards that we understood that something had gone wrong, because the army that has been fighting terrorism for 14 years is not an army that stands down, even with overwhelming forces. Yes, you can argue the fact that many of the soldiers had been decommissioned back in 2020, and then, of course, they were being pulled back in to make up the reinforcements on the lines in Hama. Many of them were rookie soldiers because they'd been conscripted in the years since really the hot war ended. So they didn't have the experience of some of the more battle-hardened brigades. But in Hama, it became very apparent that something was going on, that something had been organized external to Syria that was leading to the collapse of the Syrian army front. In Homs, it became more apparent to a degree because Hezbollah had come in, sent 3,000 soldiers to defend Homs. And there were still, I think, some Iranian soldiers on the ground then, and some of the Syrian army who were still resisting. But again, then there seemed to be this collapse and withdrawal of Iranian soldiers. Hezbollah withdrew to Lebanon. So it became apparent that the instructions were coming from somewhere else. I'm being told now that it was Turkey that told Iranian forces and Hezbollah to stand down and they would have safe passage out, but that they shouldn't stay, and obviously there shouldn't be any reinforcements, and that no forces from Iraq should come in, which is what we saw, because the Iraqi resistance came to the border, but they stayed at the border. They didn't actually enter. And then really from Homs, which is 2 hours drive from Damascus. But at that point, we were really shocked how fast it happened. And when the militants arrived in Damascus, there were videos of them taking the uniforms and the weapons from the Syrian army soldiers and telling them to go home. In the beginning, there was a lot of confusion, and a lot of soldiers that I was talking to were saying, we've got no instructions, like we don't even know what we're supposed to be doing because the command is out of touch with us. There were rumors that there'd been pager attacks. There were rumors that there had been a jamming operation on all of the communication, the ability to communicate between the different brigades and forces and their commanders. But there was a huge amount of confusion. And there was an equal amount of confusion in Hama from what I heard. So, yeah, it wasn't an easy situation for anyone, and it certainly wasn't helped. I keep saying this, but social media needs to understand it has a responsibility. Social media was increasing the panic, it was increasing the confusion, and it was increasing the speculation, which was having an absolutely catastrophic effect on the psyche of the Syrian people. It was horrible, actually.
Exactly why social media, to be honest. Those three things are the oligarchy's dream of society to be in a constant state of confusion and panic. So,
what role?
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, the last time we were on this podcast, we talked about the Muslim Brotherhood's effect on the Palestinian resistance. And this was before, I don't know, was it after October 7th? I don't know. Anyway, it was clear that Hamas was definitely on the side of these Salafis. And I'm just curious. I know they stepped back on that a little bit, I think, to gain Hezbollah's help in resisting Zionist aggression. But now Hezbollah still kind of cheered on this Salafi coup in Syria, and they're still kind of cheering it on. So now that you're in Lebanon, how Hezbollah feel? Can you comment on how Hezbollah feels about that? Because it sounds like Hamas just like is openly slapping Hezbollah in the face after they sacrificed for months and months and thousands of lives, and it seems really upsetting to me. Do you know how is that going over there?
Just to add one thing to that, the same
Yeah.
question. There's also, because like that's another question, that there's also talks that there are disagreements within Hamas on their stance with regards to HGS. So if you can also elaborate on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there always has been. We know there's always been conflict within Hamas, and of course, who were the leaders that Israel was keen to target? It was the leaders that had always maintained a loyalty to the resistance axis, and in particular to Syria. I mean, there are statements from Osama Hamdan supporting Syria, also from Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif. What was his name? Al-Suri, who was killed in, is it Al-Suri? Who was killed in Beirut, in Dahe, very early on. All of these leaders were pro-Syria, pro-Hezbollah, pro the resistance axis. And now, of course, there are still some leaders, but less prominent ones left, who would be pro-Syria. But of course, now what's happened is Khaled Mashal has come back to leadership position, and he was the one who betrayed Syria back in 2011 and was aiding Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize Syria. So, you know, for me, it's very obvious why now we're seeing Palestinians are supporting the so-called revolution in Syria, because Israel has engineered it that way. And I know people will say, yeah, well, we told you so. We told you that Israel manufactured Hamas. Well, yeah, but you're not looking at the nuance and the complexity, because there were leaders within Hamas who did not agree with this policy, who did not want to pivot towards Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the entire Muslim Brotherhood axis, which of course includes Turkey, and who did want to, who saw that their liberation lay with the resistance axis, which of course is Hezbollah in Yemen and Syria, Iraq, Iran, and anyone that I've missed out there, because I often do. And so it, again, it's a very complex situation, but I completely get now, you know, because you have Fatah elements inside Gaza itself, and many of those elements, like some of the journalists, are now supporting the terrorist groups inside Syria. But were they also cheering on the Iranian missiles? This is the problem. Is like, you know, there's very little political understanding among Palestinians, partly because they're kept in this rarefied environment in a concentration camp. The only information they were receiving for years and decades is Saudi Arabia media and Qatari media, Al Jazeera. And that's why you're seeing Al Jazeera turn against Syria now, because Al Jazeera sold the line. I lost so many friends in Gaza when I started exposing what was going on in Syria, because they just didn't believe me. Because Al Jazeera had brainwashed them into thinking Syria was some kind of anti-Palestinian entity that was murdering Palestinians in their beds. And then the Yarmouk camp narrative took huge prominence for a while. And we talked about this, I mean, the whole pro-Palestine movement in the West is pretty much dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. So that whole movement in the West of Westerners supporting Palestine was weaponized against Syria very successfully. Until 2016. So, you know, a lot of people are getting very emotionally invested in this and becoming borderline kind of white supremacist towards Arabs because of the confusion that is very, but as I said just before I'm talking to you, West Asia has probably been the most long-term targeted by the media, by the intelligence agencies, by the perception management teams in the West, in Israel, by Mossad, by CIA, by MI6 for well over a century, right? So it's really, you really can't blame factions who've been kept in these echo chambers for years for not understanding that something else is going on outside. Like, for example, when Aleppo was occupied for 5 years by the Turkish-backed militants and by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, when it was liberated, people were saying to me quite openly, my God, like, we're so happy because we thought the Syrian army was going to come in and massacre all of us. Because they were being told for those 5 years all the time. Like, you have to stay low because if the army come in, they're all Shia, they're all Alawite, they're going to massacre you because you're Sunni. They believed it.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of Stockholm syndrome in a way, because you start to believe in your captors' narratives rather than, because you don't have anything to replace it.
Al Jazeera is extremely toxic because they do such excellent reporting sometimes, and I think there are these. That's the problem with some news sources, is like they do really good reporting on some things, and then they then leverage that so that the viewer assumes that the other things are good, and they're actually very bad on, because Al Jazeera is obviously part of the Qatari government that is just salivating over a pipeline deal across Syria, and they have been for decades. So, and they just reopened talks on that. It's just they didn't even wait a week to start talking about that.
Why should they? You know?
What? Yeah, why should they? Exactly. Yeah. But I oversimplify things as well by just saying Hamas, because Hamas, when the media calls Hamas, it's actually a coalition of groups that includes communists and Christian resistance groups. So it's not just a unified fighting force either. So I sort of
yeah, and I mean the PFLP, for example, was always loyal to the resistance axis. They never ever deviated from that. So I think, you know, yeah, it's disappointing, and it's really kind of it's really saddening to see people in Gaza kind of cheering on the terrorist occupation now of Syria, or of pretty much all of Syria, alongside Israel, of course. And then to see, you know, the decimation of Syria by Israel, with HTS, who claims to support the Palestinian cause, doing nothing to prevent it, and actually saying they're not going to allow Syrian territory to be used to wage war against Israel. So that means they've thrown Palestinians under the bus, because one thing under President Assad was that all of the resistance factions were operating from inside Syria. That was what was agreed, because Syria didn't have the capability with really 3 or 4 battlefronts still ongoing, although at the time sort of low key. It didn't have the capability to provide itself any kind of military support to Palestine. But what it did do was to open up its territory to all of the resistance factions to operate from, like from the Golan territories, but also from all around Syria. And of course, what did that do? That led to the bombing of Syria by Israel on the pretense that Syria was permitting Iranian and Iraqi and Yemeni and whatever else that they could possibly think of to enter its territory.
What role do you think Russia had, and did Russia have any role in the backstage dealing that led to the Syrian army just what it looks like easily surrendering and just transitioning power to the HTS and other fractions?
My opinion, yes. I think this was a deal brokered between Trump and Russia. And I guess it will become apparent after the inauguration if suddenly we see deals being made on Ukraine. At the moment, from the evidence that I have to now, it looks very much to me as if Russia, to a degree, it had become frustrated. At the end of the day, Russia is not an ideological ally. It's not like Iran. It's not invested in the resistance. It's a very realpolitik, pragmatic nation, relatively slow to react. I mean, we saw that even in Ukraine. It took them 8 years to figure out that, the NATO threat was not going to go away and it was just going to get worse. But ideologically, it's not invested. It frankly doesn't care, right? It cares about the protection of Orthodox Christians in Syria. Yes, there it is, ideologically connected, but that's a very small minority of the bigger picture of what Syria represents to the resistance axis. And I think Assad's intransigence over Erdogan, after a number of nations, including Iran, but Russia, Iraq, had been trying to bring the two countries to a negotiation table. But of course, it was clear Erdogan's demand would be to maintain the territories, to maintain a buffer zone, to protect Turkey against the so-called Kurdish threat, that even though the Kurds were being backed by the US, another NATO member state. So, Assad was intransigent. He was like, I'm not going to normalize, I'm not going to talk until Erdogan withdraws all of his proxy and Turkish military from inside Syria. And I think for Russia, that was kind of incredibly frustrating because they wanted the whole situation resolved. They were already digging into Ukraine. They didn't want to expand more military into Syria. And it seemed to them, I suppose, and again, this is my reading of the situation, that Assad was not going to change. He wasn't going to become more compliant or more, because he hasn't ever. In his entire rule, he's been one of the most kind of consistent leaders of our time in his statements and his policies and his ideology. And even 2 weeks before this all happened, he was at the Arab League summit shaming all of the Gulf states because they've done nothing to prevent the genocide in Palestine. So all this idea that he had also pivoted towards UAE and Saudi Arabia, well, that was kind of thrown under the bus because he tore a strip out of them at the Arab League summit, right? So I think that's one element, but I think the other element is, and I've talked about this many times, the bringing Trump in is always to do deals. It's always to break up the cohesion of any kind of non-aligned axis, right? This is what he did in 2016, and this is what, in my opinion, he's being brought in to do now, because I don't believe in any US electoral process. I think each president is a chess piece that's put on the roadmap that's designed by the Zionist lobby, the deep state, and so on, right? And so Trump was elected on his end the war in Ukraine stick, right? So end nuclear war and all of this stuff. So it was very clear to me that he would start negotiations with Moscow before the inauguration. And I think, in my opinion, there is a deal that's been made, not only with Russia, but predominantly with Russia, to give concessions in Ukraine. So Russia can maintain its gas supply, it can maintain its trade and economic structures in eastern Ukraine. It has control of the Black Sea, Crimea, in return for sacrificing Syria to a large degree. This is my feeling. I'm still working on it. I'm still gathering all the evidence. So there's some things that I can't say publicly right now until I can substantiate them more. But a lot of sources are agreeing with me. And even on the battlefield, Russia withdrew, first of all, from East Aleppo. And then a lot of the statements that were being put out by Russia, I've been told, were false, like the number of terrorists that had been bombed and so on. And in all honesty, I don't understand how they couldn't wipe them out, because once they left Aleppo and came down to Hama, this is open countryside. It's not mountainous, it's flat. And it's huge roads. I mean, the Khanasa road is the main arterial road down to Damascus. How could these convoys not be destroyed? It's almost like
when
yeah, I mean,
rogue mercenary group that was heading towards Moscow last year, whatever, the Russians just destroyed their own highways to delay them, and I was shocked that I didn't see any of that action from Syria of destroying their own highways to reduce.
They did. They destroyed one bridge, I think, between Homs and Damascus. That was it. And actually, I haven't had that confirmed. The Rastan bridge. But generally speaking, they didn't do a lot of damage, and a lot of what they were reporting was exaggerated, because it gave us all a lot of hope at that time. And then nobody could quite understand why the forces were advancing so fast despite all of this hammering. And I was speaking to a soldier on the front lines, and he said, Vanessa, the drone warfare is killing us. It's just, we can't do anything against it. Because the Ukrainian technology, and then combined probably with Turkish technology that was probably accompanying the SNA forces, was overwhelming the Syrian army positions, right? So this was from someone actually on the ground fighting. So yeah, I mean, and also, of course, now what we're seeing if we look at the statements being put out by Russia, one, President Assad has been given humanitarian asylum, which for me is kind of insulting. This was the president of a country who was a fierce ally of Russia's, not only during his presidency, during his father's presidency. Since 1946, Syria has been under attack because of its alliance with Soviet Union and then with Russia. Giving humanitarian asylum is kind of insulting. I mean, at least give political asylum, because in a sense you're stripping him of his status as an ally. You're stripping him of his status, right?
He said something earlier that I heard before, like he was actually planning somehow to step down within 6 months, because I also heard that this operation with terrorists was like on the books. I don't know how someone was assuming this was on the books for like March, and they ramped it up to now. So, but I hadn't heard the part about Assad somehow planning to step down in 6 months.
That was something put out by Sputnik. So that, to me, was clearly part of the negotiation process at the time. I think Russia was trying to mitigate damage and trying to say, okay, look, let President Assad stay and oversee the transitional process. And clearly, HTS or whoever is managing them, which of course is the US alliance, didn't accept that. So then I think it probably became clear that Assad's life was at risk. And at that point, I think he was pretty much under control, to be honest. I don't think he had much say in it after that. And when you talk about did Russia have control over the decision to stand down? Yes, I do believe so. Because the commander who was given the overall command was known to be one of the closest commanders to Russia.
Well, given
so
that
I think there is a very strong possibility.
And he was this commander was released from duty, right? Or is this the new commander that was put in its place?
The one that was the one that was released from duty. In fact, not only one, a number of them were released from duty and kind of disappeared off the battlefield. Were the ones that would have kept fighting, in my opinion, because I know 2 or 3 of them, and I know that they would never in a million years have laid down arms.
So then they were replaced with the yes men for this plan. That makes sense. But the other thing is we haven't heard from Assad, which, I mean, if you look at this from an outside perspective without any, it looks kind of like Assad was kidnapped, because he was hurried off to the military base and then flown to Russia. And it was like, I mean, that could have totally been basically against his will. We don't know. And I mean, that's just
well, he has allegedly put out a statement, although although the elements surrounding it are a bit weird. I don't believe the president had the password of the Telegram channel and he published it. And I also find it very hard to believe that mainstream media wouldn't jump at the chance of publishing a statement from the president, because they've been desperate to get something out of him, and they've been trying to track him down to get him to speak. So it doesn't make sense to me. But I think, when you mentioned the fact that he'd been planning this for some time, and definitely Western media is trying to show it this way. I mean, the FT put out something saying that he'd been buying property in Russia for some time. He'd transferred millions of dollars over to Russia, etc. So they're obviously trying to portray this as something that it
did leave. His kids and his wife, they were already there at the time, right? So there was a little
No, they weren't. No, they weren't. That's another bit of misinformation.
Really? How did they?
No. Should I tell you?
All right. His connection is slow. Yeah.
No, basically, I mean, Assad had gone to Moscow. He'd gone to Moscow for, I think it was his son's graduation or something to do with the university. It wasn't an official trip. And when everything kicked off, he came back and he brought, I don't think Asma came back, but his kids came back with him. I mean, I've been told this by a number of seriously close people to the palace, that he came back So if this is someone who had been planning
Yeah.
for months to kind of abandon his country, betray his people, turn it all over to HTS, why did he come back? And when he came back, he had no intention of standing down. He had no intention of not resisting. That was clear from the statement that was put out, or even though I will still put question marks over how it was put out and why it was put out. And he doesn't, of course, mention anything about Russia in the statement. He mentions the Syrian Arab Army and so on, but he's obviously quite, let's say, careful about not saying anything about Russia. But that I would expect, because he's taken humanitarian asylum in Russia. So clearly he's going to be monitored as to what he's stating publicly. But no, it became very clear because he came back, and in fact, on the Saturday, the two people that I spoke to, both of them said to me, "No, look, the president's still here. It's fine. Like, everything's okay. Well, it's under control. We don't need to panic. Everyone should stop panicking," because he was still here. And then, there did seem to be all of this confusion where people were reaching out to him and communicating with him, and even he was saying, "No, it's all okay." And then suddenly he disappeared, literally disappeared. So I think at a certain point, Russia realized, no, this is really not good. This is going to be another Gaddafi scenario, and we've got to get him out, and we can't allow him to communicate with anyone, which of course left people feeling betrayed. And that's a lot of what you're seeing on social media. But, my response to that is, if he's acting completely out of character, at least wait before you rush to judgment on him, because and I know people are going to accuse me of defending Assad, but I'm not. I'm defending a human being that has never shown any such tendency. In fact, he's spoken out against it in the past, in 2012 and so on, that anybody that leaves the country in any way is not a patriot and so on. And he's always been consistent. So me personally, I think he was forced to do what he did. I don't think he had any option on it, for the safety of his kids as well, who were with him.
His kids were with him when he left.
As far as I know, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Because they came back with him. They came back with him.
Wow.
Right. And then they disappeared together. That's what you're saying, right? Okay. I'm sure you've read Iranian officials, especially the Iranian foreign minister's statement on what happened. And there are 2 points. One, that Assad rejected Iranian military's advice on how to boost the morale of the army because they were losing morale and everything. The second thing is that the generals, the commanders, as well as the personnel were really underpaid, and that was one of the factors that led to the Syrian army being more likely to surrender. So what do you think about that, and how much do you think that really played a role?
Look, the Syrian Arab army was always under-equipped, and it was always underpaid. It didn't stop them fighting for 14 years. And I think both Russia and Iran had influence in the military in Syria. I think, if they're being honest, they had influence within certain factions in the military in Syria.
In the same line?
The Russian in the same line? What do you mean?
In the same line, or conflicting interests. Okay.
Conflicting. Yeah. It was well known that certain brigades were more affiliated with Iran and others were more affiliated with Russia, for example. Right? I mean, this was something that was very well known inside Syria. So I think, no, I think it's much simpler than that. I think Iran's influence in Syria had for some time been eclipsed by Russia's. That was evident from the increase in personnel and equipment at the military base in Haimamim, the expansion of the base. And I think Assad had always wanted to some degree, keep balance between the allies, because for Syria it was incredibly difficult, because it was effectively a world war inside Syrian territory. And some factions were going to attack Syria because of Iran, and other factions were going to attack Syria because of their relationship with Russia. I mean, I've talked about the historical relationship that has always engendered Western interference in Syria's affairs. So in reality, it was an incredibly difficult balancing role that President Assad had. And I think, unfortunately, it's a bit like, that Greek plate spinning thing, where there were just too many plates spinning. And I think Iran was one of the plates that fell more recently. But I don't agree with some people that are saying, from Iran, that are saying, well, we realized that Assad was not going to stand, and so therefore Iran withdrew its troops, because I don't think there was any indication from President Assad that he wasn't going to stand.
Right.
So I think everyone is kind of slightly mitigating their position at the moment, including Russia. They're not going to say, yeah, we did a deal on Ukraine and like we just left all the Syrian people to HTS. They're never going to say this, right? And unfortunately, I think, Assad and the Syrian army is getting all the flack at the moment and all the blame. And I think that's
Time will.
a little bit.
The Syrian Arab
Yeah,
army.
time will tell.
Yeah, time will tell. But also, I think this idea that they were underpaid, and so the Syrian Arab army would surrender to Salafi head choppers, who the first thing they're going to do is go look for army IDs and cut the heads off the military. I just don't see that. I see that as like very Western propaganda to try and explain this, because, like you said, they've always been underpaid force, and it just seems like a really strange rationale. Just because, I'm getting paid too much, so okay, terrorists, come kill my family members and chop my head off. It just seems.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, would it really make any difference? They've never had updated equipment. They've always been fighting with inferior equipment to their enemies, because at the end of the day, their enemies are backed by the US, the UK, the EU, the Gulf states, Israel, Turkey. I mean, Turkey is the biggest military in the world, isn't it, after the US? So, right. They've always been up against it. That's never changed. There was a degree of demoralization after 2020 because the economic situation was horrible, because of the sanctions and because of the occupation of the oil and agricultural resources, pretty much all, not only in the Northeast, but in the Northwest and in the South and so on. So yeah, morale was low. But at the end of the day, those soldiers would fight for nothing before to defend their families, to defend their communities, and to defend a secular Syria. It's not, I always said it's not about one man. It's not about President Assad. It's about what Syria represents, these people, which was always coexistence of all of these minority sects. And actually, there's been a few. Sorry.
And about who would replace that? It's the Iranians hated Saddam, but what was replaced by Saddam? Or a lot of people in the Muslim community also didn't like Gaddafi, but what was replaced by him? That's also another point.
And doesn't Mubarak, mean that even Mubarak in Egypt, most Egyptians now would wish for Mubarak over what they have now. And there was recently a video of members of the Tiger Forces special.
We lose Vanessa.
See,
Vanessa, you broke up. Well, it's amazing we had this long of a connection from
50 minutes. Exactly.
Internet there is so bad.
No, the point that I wanted to make, there have been videos put out by former Tiger Forces or 25th Brigade Special Forces. And they've actually been very open. They've said, no, we're going to continue the resistance. I think they're on the border with Lebanon. They're going to continue resisting for Syria. And despite the betrayal of the high command, they did not stand down. That statement's been put out on a couple of videos now by soldiers that were not captured and have carried on fighting.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I would, I mean, I think something that's important for people to remember, and tell me if you disagree or not, is that, like, even though Assad, I mean, it seems like he was extremely influential in this. He, in the end, in the realpolitik version, he just became like a pawn of the superpowers. And so we can't, like, it's hard to, assume that he had like a lot of free will in this situation, because Russia is a huge influence, Turkey's a huge influence, and he can only do so much. And a lot of the propaganda to try and blame him, even though people obviously have all sorts of different feelings about him, but the idea that he had this battlefield had been so inundated by superpowers that it's like I don't know. I feel like we're being pushed by propaganda to make it sound like it was his fault, when in fact it could have been decided on.
Yeah, and I just think that's, you know, we've seen that happen too many times, and I don't think we should allow it to happen again. I think there should be discussion like the ones that we're having, you know. And I'm not saying that I'm any arbiter of truth, but I'm just trying to go through the process of logically understanding what happened. And I think to say, all the Syrian army is useless, it all surrendered, and or it's all President Assad's fault, or it's all Iran's fault, or it's all Russia, you know, I think it's way more complex than that. And we haven't really talked about the Israeli role, and my battery is going down quite fast. You know, so there's a huge amount at play here, and I think one of the most obvious things to me is that HTS is going to do absolutely nothing to prevent Israeli expansionism and aggression against Syria, which was like the central hub for the resistance axis from all perspectives. And now their airspace is open to Israeli planes to attack Iran,
right,
and Iraq, of course, because Iraq will be probably next.
Vehicles that they know are transporting goods from Iran based on satellite intelligence. So I've heard the argument that, oh, but now Syria is like a smuggler's paradise, and so they'll be able to ship anything they want to Hezbollah. But the difference is now there's no air cover to prevent the bombing of these trucks on the M5 highway. So like there's likely to be a lot less.
I mean, it's kind of like an Israeli satellite state right now, you know, sadly. Because Israel has free reign to fly over at any time, and America and Turkey.
The Israeli motivation in this really doesn't need to be discussed. I mean, they're displaying it every day.
Yeah, I know.
But
I know, but some people aren't putting it together. You know, the fact that HTS is having professed its support of Palestine is now basically rolling over for Israel to do what it wants inside Syria.
It's definitely a proxy force of Israel. There's no question about that. To the rational.
Their statement too that they're not going to have any conflict with Israel, and their enemy that they're now focused on is Hezbollah and Iran. Like, I mean, the enemy at their border is just bombing on a daily basis.
It's unbelievable.
And you know, they're no longer terrorists, and now the sanctions are going to be lifted, and HTS is not going to be prescribed, but Hamas is. So, you know, if you're against genocide in Palestine, you're going to get arrested. But Jolani, who committed multiple atrocities against civilians in Syria and Iraq, is going to be soon visiting London as a
London
Syrian representative.
I mean, it's wearing a suit, so it's not.
And London, it's the same city where Richard Medhurst faces like years in prison for simply saying good things about the resistance. So that shows you who. Anyway. On the idea of Israel, before we lose your battery, I don't know if you heard Alex Krainer's theory. He spelled it out. He has a kind of an interesting theory that this is actually a trap that was set for the Israelis and the U.S., kind of like Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union, in that this is like a larger game for Russia, where they think that they, like the U.S. drained Russia in Afghanistan, that drained the Soviets in Afghanistan, that they think they can drain the U.S. Israel in Syria. What do you think of that theory?
I think. I mean, I love Alex Krainer, but I do think this is a little bit too much hopium for me. It's just like, Russia doesn't really do 6D chess or whatever. Neither does Trump. Neither does any of these people. Russia is kind of a lumbering, huge, vast machine. It doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't think like this. And you're totally, or rather he's completely ignoring that Russia has good relations with Israel. There are a lot of Zionists inside Russia. No, they're not going to want to trap Israel. Why? I mean, all through the genocide of Palestine, they've been putting out statements that are really weak on the genocide. They're still pushing the two-state solution. No, Russia's relations with Israel, are strong.
I mean, even in Russia, hasn't Russia been providing like airspace to Israel if Russia wanted to stop Israel's plane from like bombing Damascus, like before all of this, they could have done that. So it doesn't look like there is a very strong desire to stop Israel from expanding into the region.
I mean, no, I think, I agree. I mean, I think to some degree, Russia, that was agreed with Damascus because the Syrian air defense were capable of bringing down the missiles that Israel was firing only from Lebanese airspace or from Jordanian airspace or from the airspace over Al Tanf. It was rare that Israel actually entered Syrian airspace prior to HTS taking over, when they're like invading it all the time.
Right.
But yeah, I think Russian relations with Israel are kind of rule that one out for me. And also, even I think Russia, if it's in its interest and if Trump offers a good enough deal, they'll pivot west. I don't think Russia has any, and neither do I think China has any qualms about doing that, because, as I said, it's not an ideological anti-imperialist stand from them as it is from the resistance axis. So it would be marvelous if this were the fact, but the facts on the ground just tell me no, that's like, it's not happening, and even if it were, okay, let's just assume it is correct, right? It still means that they've sacrificed all of the Syrian people, because the ethnic cleansing programs are correct. The persecution of Christians and Alawite and Shia. Why are there thousands of Shia gathering at the Syrian border to escape? Why are Christians wanting to leave? Why are Alawites? And why is there a witch hunt? So basically, even if this is correct, it still means they've abandoned the Syrian people to the horrors of living under HTS rule. So either way, doesn't appeal to me as a hero. No, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I think Alexander Dugin also said something similar, that this was a trap for Erdogan, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think Sam Husseini said something like, those who are losing who still think they're winning, or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's just opium. Opium's very, very alluring.
It's very addictive, and I kind of get it. People that put Russia and the non-aligned axis up on a pedestal, but I can also tell you that I'm hearing a lot of South Americans also thinking that Russia betrayed Syria, or if not betrayed, then they had their own interests that overrode their interests in Syria, let's say. And I think a lot of them are now reconsidering BRICS and looking at Russia and saying, well, if you can do this to one of your allies, then what's the difference? We might as well stick with the US, because it's the devil we know rather than, because potentially there is going to be military intervention in Venezuela, for example, right? And they did allow Brazil to veto Venezuela joining BRICS. So I think even in Latin America, there's a lot of questions being raised right now.
Yeah, definitely BRICS is going to have some difficult rows to hoe if, Iran is the last basically anti-imperialist power. I don't know. That's a very depressing thought that BRICS itself might be just waiting to be Western aligned. I don't know, but
it's also everything is also very threatening to Iranians in Iran because the very similar economic difficult situation that the Syrian people went through, what made them turn against their government, is going on in Iran. I mean, it's still not as bad, but it's going that direction, and that's very concerning. So,
well, and that's deliberate, that's what they're trying to engineer. And also the isolation, like they've isolated Palestine, they've isolated Lebanon, they're on the way to isolating Syria. Next, it will be Iraq. Jordan, as I've said, will just be pressured into taking probably the Palestinians from Gaza because it's got the threat of multiple hostile forces on its border now, including HTS. The last thing it wants is an invasion, So Israel will pressure Jordan to take the refugees from Gaza in particular. And then if Iraq is isolated, then of course, ultimately Iran is isolated. So that's the plan, is to isolate every sector of the resistance axis from each other.
Well, it's wishful thinking to be hopeful, but I don't know. I mean, I hope something miraculous happens, and some of these theories that we have been hearing.
I mean, it does give me hope that we see these kind of army groups now appearing and issuing challenges and saying, we're not going to stop fighting. You will have to martyr us before we abandon Syria. And this, for me, also proves my point that they were also let down. It's not, you can't say the whole of the Syrian army just gave up. They didn't. There's
also 27 million people in Syria versus 20,000 head choppers. I think it's like, I mean, those numbers don't seem that.
How many people in Syria?
Was it 27 million? Was that the number I heard? How many?
No, it's around 18 million now. It was, I think, around 23 million, and more than 6 million are displaced. So it's around 18 million. Yeah, but you've also got to remember, as I said, it's not only Idlib. So there's more than, according to UN, which of course is never very reliable, but there's more than 2 million people in Idlib. Not all of them are going to be HTS and so on, but as Brett McGurk said, it's the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. And then you've got the Free Syrian Army factions in the north. So as I said, it wasn't only an attack from the northwest; it was also by the Turkish proxies or Turkish sub-militia in the north.
And how many ISIS are in prison?
Probably special forces.
In the Kurdish prisons, there's a bunch of ISIS that they're threatening to release, right?
Yeah. Well, they're talking about 11,000. In fact, that was Iran that talked about that. 11,000 ISIS in Iraq. But we know they've been percolating ISIS from Syria to Iraq and from Iraq to Syria for some time. But it's not only in the holding camps in the northeast. You've got them in Al Tanif, you've got them in Rukban, which are on the border with Jordan, which is another threat to Jordan, of course. But they will be triggered in Iraq in particular. But also, ultimately in Syria, what are you going to end up with? A kind of Libya where all of the warring factions, and I mean, you've got Uzbek, you've got Turkmenistan, you've got Uyghurs, and even I know that the Chinese ambassador is being told it's not safe for you to go back. There's more than 10,000 Uyghurs in Syria now and in Damascus. So at some point, just as they did in the areas that they occupied, they're going to start fighting amongst themselves. This is inevitable.
And I heard statements like that they believe that they have more right than Syrians to live there because they fought for the liberation of Syria. So these are like Zionist occupiers.
Yeah, and they see it as a caliphate, so it becomes irrelevant that it's Syria, it's their territory because they conquered it, is how they see it, from what I understand from the statements that have been put out.
What a Syrian revolution that is.
Yeah.
Unbelievable people call it that. So Dara and I were noticing recently a trend where people are calling it the Islamic revolution. They're using the same term to describe this as the movement that brought the dictator of Iran down with a people's revolution in Iran.
Without understanding that revolution was not, was like indigenous and popular revolution that caught the hands of the imperialists from Iran. But this so-called revolution that has nothing to do with Islam actually facilitated the US and Israel's access to the Syrian land. So it's like a huge difference. Right. But, people are Islamophobic as they are, so that's the way they want to, like they reveal their Islamophobic tendencies when they want to cheer or even criticize what HDS is doing.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the media is working overtime to vilify the outgoing government and to wipe clean the records of people like Mohammed Aloush, who led Jaish al-Islam, who was one of the most brutal groups in Syria, led the massacres in Adra in 2013, imprisoned thousands in the Tauba jails, put Alawites into cages as human shields in eastern Ghouta, and he's now in government. It's just like, I don't know, the world has become such a surreal dystopia that it's very difficult to actually deal with it right now. Regardless of
jobs on now in Damascus. So when do you think we'll have the Women Life Freedom for Syria movement? Fight for the.
Oh, but you don't know. When Al-Julani does it, it's a fatherly and protective.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like the mullahs in Iran, the Shia mullahs in Iran, who are, it's very different.
Yeah.
That was exactly a BBC Persian headline that the Syrian girl who was told by Al-Julani to cover her hair said that this was a fatherly and protective advice coming from Al-Julani. So, it's different.
Yeah, it's a weird world.
It's a very weird world, and it's not going to get any less weird anytime soon, I don't think. I think we should all prepare for it becoming a lot worse before it gets any better.
Yeah, we were hoping to see the decline of the imperialist powers soon, but suddenly it's like flipped, and it looks like.
I know.
But well, I believe we have faith.
Keep fighting. We have to keep fighting. It's not. There, and the thing is that people need to understand, it's, as I keep saying, it's not about President Assad or President Mubarak, or it's not about these one person narratives that they put out. It's about actually believing in certain values and certain genuine freedoms for people that are not manipulated by external forces. Whether it's Russia or whether it's, I remember speaking to to one of the kind of intelligence heads in Syria, and even he said to me, Vanessa, he said, it's like we all interfere too much in Syrian affairs, all of us, even Russia, and that was 2017.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just like, we just have to keep believing in a world that is a hell of a lot better than it is right now, because it's hideous at the moment.
Yeah, hopefully.
Oh, so we wrap up there.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming back. It's the internet and all the interview requests we have. We really appreciate it, and it's good to see you in good health.
Thanks for having me on, and it's always good to speak to you guys, just to get another perspective from you as well. It's really helpful. We'll see.
Very impressive that you, after just like a day after escaping that hellish situation, you're giving so many interviews, and I commend you for doing that. I think it's very important. You're one of the only voices out there that can be culturally understood by many people outside of the situation. So I think you have, even though indigenous voices are also very important, there is definitely real value in having someone who has a shared culture tell you something from the ground, because just how human biases work. So I think your voice is extremely important, and I really commend you for having the strength to keep doing these interviews, even though you're going through a lot personally. So
thank you. That's really kind. And I would just ask people, don't forget the Syrian people, because you're just going to get swamped with media coverage that is going to show everything is perfect and how much better it's all working. It isn't. People are terrified. A lot of people are too afraid to leave the house. They're receiving daily, hourly death threats. There are people stuck in Latakia and Tartus that can't get out. There are war heroes, disabled war heroes that can't even move because they've lost legs or arms, that are getting death threats and can't easily get out. So please don't forget that aspect of it, because it's going to get really scary, because there's going to be a complete kind of blanket on alternative views, because no one is there that can produce any alternative views now. So just don't forget those people.
They are.
CNN is doing that for us.
Oh yeah. But anyway, that's just what I want to say, because I'm really scared that they're just going to get forgotten and potentially killed without anyone even realizing it's going on.
Yeah. Well, keep posting the videos on your Telegram channel so we can keep with the situation. How can people follow you? You have a Telegram channel. You have
Telegram, Substack. Those are the main ones. X, although I'm kind of staying out of that at the moment because of the amount of kind of convoluted analysis going on there. And YouTube, but not so much. I keep getting strikes, of course.
All right. Well,
so Substack is the main one. Telegram.
We'll link to you on the Telegram channel. As usual, we post a lot of what you post on our channel because you find real gems. So really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again soon. I'm going to wrap up, Sarah.
Lots of love.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for watching another episode of Twice Told Tales. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. See you next episode.